And all through the night, the three ponies kept the fire of friendship alive by telling stories to one another and by singing songs, which, of course, became the winter carols that we all sing today. The narrator spoke, in turn, as the action on the stage began to play out his words. Each of the ponies were dressed in different attire, each representing a different style of clothing that was worn so long ago. A younger Twilight watched the stage curiously. It wasn't her first time watching the Hearthwarming's Eve pageant. Far from it. It was traditional for many ponies to come and watch the pageant every year. Her parents had taken her in years past, and now that she was the personal protege of Princess Celestia, she felt as if it were more of an obligation to go see the play. The filly was sure some parts of the play were exaggerated or kept short for the sake of being produced as a single play, but she still always had a fascination with the history, and this was one of the few plays that spoke of it. Eventually, the narrator continued his tale. The warmth of the fire and singing and laughing reached the leaders, and their bodies began to thaw, and it even began to melt their hearts. The actors on the stage came together, hugging one another in their display of friendship. The ice on the stage melted away, and the 6 ponies walked forth, viewing the lands before them. The 3 great leaders agreed to share the beautiful land and live in harmony forever afterwards. And together, they named their land Equestria! The 6 ponies on stage called out together. Though it was unheard, Twilight had muttered the same thing under her breath, in unison with the ponies. The memorized play rolled through her head as she spoke the final words. The crowd around her began to cheer loudly as the curtains quickly came to a close. The crowd continued its loud cheering as the curtains then made their way open once more, the 6 ponies taking a quick bow. The loud orchestra behind the stage began to stir, music filling the hall quickly with the familiar notes. Confetti and streamers fired from above the stage, raining on the crowd the party decorations. Bells chimed across the stage in the hall, and the 6 ponies began to sing alongside the music. The crowd didn't skip a beat, and joined along with the song. The air was awash of joy and friendship. Every pony here was a brother or a sister, and it was time of celebration in unison. Every word floated through the air as if caressing the very world around it, before being replaced with the next. The fire of friendship in our hearts, as long as it burns we cannot drift apart. Though quarrels arise, our numbers are few, laughter and singing will see us through. We are a circle of pony friends. A circle of friends will be till the very end. Though Twilight sang along, she didn't put her heart into the words. It was Hearthwarming Eve. All the ponies around her were joyous, cheering their hearts out for the wondrous holiday they were all on. But for some reason the filly that sang along with them wasn't feeling the normal spirit of the holiday. Something about this Hearthwarming's just didn't seem like the same as earlier years. The caroling came to an end as the curtains closed for the last time on stage. The crowd broke out into another round of cheers and applause for the incredible play that they had just witnessed. It took a few minutes of murmuring and chattering amongst the crowd, but the ponies slowly began to fiddle out of the hall, going back out into the cold winter air. The sun was getting close to the horizon, preparing to set, and soon the night sky would bring the familiar frozen nights of the mountain city. The lavender filly walked out of the hall alongside the crowd, her hooves touching the chilled road of Canterlot streets. She took a deep breath and cooled her lungs before expelling her hot breath into the air, creating a small cloud of warm air in front of her face. She turned her head and looked around her for a moment. Everywhere around her, ponies were in a rush, looking for that next perfect moment, or that last perfect gift to give to a loved one, trying to get that last bit of decoration they needed so that their display would be just perfect, finding friends or family so that they could spend the rest of the night together. Every pony was in a hurry, fluttering from store to store, pony to pony. Twilight continued to walk through the streets, passing the decorative lights that made the town glow, wreaths hung with care along walls and windows, ribbons tied to every pole and hanging across the streets. Several pine trees had been planted throughout the town, and decorated completely, and snow covered the streets and ledges of the entire town. It was just like every other Hearthwarming's Eve she had seen before. The sounds of the bustling streets began to go quiet, as Twilight walked further along and away from the crowd, to the downtown Canterlot. She was headed straight home that evening, not wanting to deal with any other pony if she could help it. She wasn't even sure what had compelled her to go see Hearthwarming's Eve pageant that day. Perhaps it was a feeling of obligation, a feeling of tradition, or even a feeling that she belonged there. Whatever it was, she had wasted her time enough and wanted to get home. The fresh snow crunched under her hooves as she walked through the frozen town, quickly reaching the quiet street of her home, the female dormitories at Princess Celestia's School for Gifted Unicorns. The sun had begun setting during her walk, and was slowly disappearing beyond the horizon, half of it already engulfed by a shadow of the world. As it set, a few clouds over the city began to release fresh snow over the city, no doubt a Pegasus performing their duties unseen above the clouds. The flakes fell softly on the ground below, adding to the collection of snow that was already gathered. She'd be home in just a few minutes, and she could curl up with her bed with a good book. "Twilight!" The lavender unicorn stopped from her advances by another call of a filly. She recognized the voice, one of her classmates, and one of the more popular fillies in her class. She turned and saw the white-coated unicorn walking towards her, with her wavy crimson hair that graced her head ever immaculately brushed. The blue eyes of hers stood out in comparison with her body, as it flared out of how accented the cold air was. "Oh, hey, Moondancer." Twilight spoke naturally, not having expected a new visitor. "I'm glad I caught you." Moondancer came just a few feet from Twilight before stopping. What smile she always had sported was stuck to her face, the one that seemed to get every colt to swoon to her. "There's a Hearthwarming's Eve party over by the male dorms, and everyone was invited. You should come. There'll be lots of stallions there." Moondancer looked at Twilight from the sides of her eyes with that last remark, putting a heavy emphasis on the fact that there'd be stallions, as though that was what Twilight needed to know right now. A bunch of immature colts swooning over Moondancer and her attractive friends, and not even paying attention to the bookish lavender unicorn at the back of the room. Not that Twilight would ever have wanted that kind of attention anyway. If she wanted any stallion in her life, it'd have to be a like-minded intellectual. Thanks, Moondancer, but I've got things I wanted to do tonight." Twilight skirted around the issue, starting to turn away from Moondancer. "I'm just going to head back to my dorm now." "Are stallions not your thing?" Moondancer asked quizzically, before Twilight had her back turned. This caused the unicorn to visibly flinch, freezing on her spot. "Is that it? Well, there'll be lots of mares there, too, if you want. I'm sure there's plenty who are open to that kind of thing." Moondancer put a hoof to her chin in thought. "This has nothing to do with that." Twilight quickly turned to face Moondancer again, huffing loudly, a cloud of mist floating past her face from behind her heated breath. The moment the mist flew past her eyes, she realized something was wrong. "I have more important things that I can be doing than going to some silly party." She closed her eyes, trying to control the emotions she felt welling inside of her. That wasn't like her. She normally had a studied control over her emotions. Moondancer just frowned at her response, either from not having expected it, or disappointed in what it meant. She had a habit of pushing issues if she really felt they were unnecessary, but it seems this wasn't one of those times to push it. "Fine." Moondancer finally spoke, starting to turn away from the frustrated unicorn before her. Twilight opened her eyes and looked with surprise at Moondancer. "You can come by later if you want. The party's supposed to end by 10, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of ponies still partying long into the night." With that, the white-coated unicorn turned away and flicked her tail in the snow gathered on it, beginning to head towards the male dormitories. Twilight hesitated, watching Moondancer walk away. She felt another compulsion rising into her gut, yet another action she would normally have under control and wouldn't have acted upon, and she found her mouth opening and calling out to the white unicorn that was quickly retreating. "Moondancer!" The white unicorn stopped, turning in surprise to look at Twilight from over her shoulder. "I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation." A smile came to Moondancer's face. "Any time, Twilight." Moondancer waved quickly, a bright smile returning. With those parting words, Moondancer quickly walked down the rest of the path, disappearing from sight before too long. The lavender unicorn just stood on the bridge, having watched Moondancer walk out of sight. When she was gone, she tried to go over the conversation they just had in her head, and why she had acted the way she had. The whole day had been one big, confusing mess of mixed feelings, and right now wasn't any better. Stupid hearth-warming Eve. Twilight spoke softly to herself, watching her hot breath mist in the air. It's messing with my head. It was the only logical conclusion that book-oriented unicorn could come up with. With this logic firmly put in her place in the mind, she was finally able to get her hooves moving again. The unicorn shivered as she suddenly realized that snow had been accumulating on her mane and back as she just stood there. She shook herself free from the specks that had started to melt and wet her fur. Now she really was cold. A breeze blew down and accentuated the point that she needed to get inside. She picked up the pace and began to run, no longer feeling like walking through the frozen night air. She hadn't noticed it, but the sun had set during their conversation, and the starry sky was shining overhead once again. The stars brought the chilled night air with them, as though they blew the cold air across the lands. The wisps of her breath flew past the unicorn's face as she ran, her body slowly losing its heat. Her building was coming into view quickly, the decorated and snow-covered dorm that she called home now. The spiral staircase that wound around the building led to her door, just as the wind and snow began to pick up. She pushed against the doors, and they quickly swung open, letting the air into the darkened room. She then shut the door behind her, cutting off the tundra outside and entering her sanctuary anymore, and the world fell silent once more. Twilight shook her mane, trying to get as much of the snow and water off her body as she could. While she got a lot, she needed a proper towel, perhaps even some blankets and a cup of hot cocoa. She would certainly warm her up and get her feeling like her old self. "Spike!" Twilight called out in the dark room. "Could you set up the fire?" Her calls were met with her own, an echoing, bouncing off the large empty room before returning in silence. Twilight blinked in confusion at the sudden lack of sound, not used to being so alone in the room before. "Spike?" She called out once more, again only returning by her echo, followed by silence. "Spike, where are—" "Oh." Twilight stopped herself, having remembered the conversation she'd had with Spike yesterday. He'd be staying with Princess Celestia for hearth-warming Eve. The princess was his guardian, after all. Though Spike had started living with Twilight recently, he still looked up to Celestia like a mother. That meant that Twilight was by herself. It wasn't even that she had forgotten that she was going to be alone that night. She had just pushed it to the edge of her mind and hadn't wanted to think about it. But there she now stood, cold, in a dark room all by herself with no one around. There were many nights where she just wished to be alone, and just curl up with a book and read the night away. However, something stirred inside her chest, and she suddenly didn't feel like being alone. She wanted Spike to be there with her, but she couldn't pull him away from the time spent with the princess. She wasn't that cruel. She'd also already turned down the invitation to the party. She couldn't bring herself to go there now. The lavender unicorn shook her head and focused magic into her horn. The lights around the room brightened and banished the shadows to the recesses of the corners once more. Her magic then connected to the heater in her room and lit the kindling inside of it. Soon a fire was roaring within the red machine and began sending out waves of heat into the chilled room. Twilight moved across her living room, glancing out the large window that separated her from the frozen snow outside, before making her way up to the stairs to her second floor. Several shelves of tall books scoured the room. several ladders placed against them to make access to the books easier. And this was her favorite part of her dorm, and one of the benefits she had of being the princess's personal protege. She didn't want to take too long in deciding her reading material for the night, so her horn lit up and grabbed several books from the historical section without looking. She then proceeded back downstairs, where the room was starting to be warmed up considerably now. The unicorn quickly approached her bed, pulling the covers back and nestling into the sheets. They were cool for the moment, but they would heat up soon enough. She propped up her pillow and rested her back and head against them, finding herself now neatly bundled in her bed. She grabbed the first book she had pulled from the shelf and read the cover. The Basic History of the Pre-Classical Era. Twilight opened the book and began to read to herself. Cobblestone Moor was the first stallion to discover that by mixing broken stones with certain types of sand and water, it was possible to create a material that could weld rocks together. This discovery allowed for faster creation of ancient buildings, as well as more stable homes for ponies to live in. The inventor, decided to name his creation Mortar, after himself. The normally book-loving unicorn blinked in confusion as she felt herself stiffen. It wasn't from the fact that the history was boring. In fact, she found the creation of such material quite fascinating. However, something just didn't feel right. She couldn't find herself wanting to read much more. She tried to force her eyes down the rest of the page, but her mind just blocked out the rest of the words. She growled in frustration and closed the book, moving to the next one. She opened the book and began reading again. Her eyes scanned across the first few sentences before the same feeling hit her. She just wasn't interested in reading, was what it wanted to say. She pushed that book aside and grabbed yet another one. For every book she had grabbed from upstairs, she found herself hitting the same wall. She just did not care to read tonight. In her frustration, she grabbed the books and tossed them to the floor, letting them fall scattered. She glared at each one of the different colored tomes that lay on the floor, shifting all the blame of her inability to read onto them. The books must have been doing something wrong after all. She loved reading, and couldn't get enough of it. The unicorn grabbed her covers and wrapped herself tighter in the sheets, trying to figure out what was going on in her mind. This wasn't like her at all. She just wanted to read and pass the time before going to bed. It would be hearth-warming tomorrow. She could get to see Spike and the princess, her parents. They'd all have gifts for her, and she had a few gifts wrapped up waiting to be given to them as well. This was a day to celebrate, to enjoy, and be happy. Yet she found herself cold, alone, and miserable. Her eyes drifted to her window as she saw the snowflakes falling from the sky, dancing to the wind in the moonlit night. They scurried back and forth, never alone, always together in their collective dance. It was as if they were all synchronized with each other's disorganized chaos. Her mind drifted away as she watched the falling snow. I just had a bad day, Twilight murmured to herself, her horn lighting up as the magic reached out of the various lanterns around her house and turned them off. Then she cranked the heat up a little more to help warm the room faster. And that's all it was. Tomorrow, I'll see my family. I'll see Spike and the princess, and everything will be better. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to get some sleep. Everything will be better tomorrow.